So let's talk about how to connect two ropes together for climbing, mountaineering or ski mountaineering. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Dave Searle and I'm an IFMGA guide based out in Chamonix. If you're new to my channel, then make sure you head down there and hit that subscribe button, and don't worry, it's completely free and it means that you won't miss any of these future videos. At the moment, I'm also working on an app which you might have heard about, but maybe you haven't. It's called Oak and it's aiming to be the largest online community for outdoor adventure sports enthusiasts, and it's hoping to cater to people who would like to join up with other people and organise their trips, or if they also want to sign up to paid courses with a guide or an instructor, for example. So there really is something for everybody on this app. If you're a guide or instructor, for example, you can post your courses on the app. And also, if you're a beginner, then it could be a really good way to meet people and start forming relationships to head out and do things. We've just added a new filtering feature into the app, which means that you can now filter by activity type and location, which should make it a lot easier to find places outside of Chamonix, which is where we've currently launched. I'll leave a link down in the description, go check it out, let me know what you think in the comments, or even send me a DM on Instagram and share with me your thoughts about the app. Okay, so back to connecting ropes together for climbing and mountaineering. So why do we connect ropes together? Why don't we just get a super long rope and just use that for everything that we need? Well, the problem with having a super long rope is oftentimes we're operating in a team of two and we have a long approach to get to a climb. And it's really nice to be able to split the weight evenly between the people in the party. So having two ropes is a really good way to do that. Also, in some types of climbing, it's preferable to use two ropes because, for example, if you're trad climbing, it's nice to be able to separate the protection and have two lines of rope going up, and that just reduces the rope drag that you have. But when do we actually connect the ropes together? Well, that would typically be for rappelling or abseiling back down to the bottom. But there are also other times that we might want to connect two ropes together. Another example might be if you were fixing lines whilst you were mountaineering and you wanted to make kind of a handrail up the mountain. You might run out of rope at some point and need to add in an extra rope into that system, and being able to connect those two ropes together with a really strong solid knot is super important. Another example of when we might connect two ropes together is if we're doing a multi-pitch climb that's, let's say for example, it's two pitches, and somebody has an accident, let's say something hits them on the arm and they can't continue climbing, we could connect those two ropes together and lower them a full length of both ropes all the way down to the ground. So that's a really good tool to have, especially for those of you who are operating in the UK, for example, where quite often the cliffs are somewhere between 50 and 100 meters in length. I'm thinking of places like Tremadog, for example. We also might be connecting ropes together when we're forming a loop around a object, for example a tree or a boulder, to rappel off. Let's say we're leaving some cordelette behind and we want to tie that together in a loop. You might also be connecting a thicker rope and a thinner rope together. For example, if you're using a thicker rope to climb with on a multi-pitch sport route or a route that involves some sort of aid climbing, and then you might be connecting a thinner tag line to that. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at that later on in this video. So we're going to look at a bunch of different knots that could be really useful to add into your arsenal, but why would you need to learn more than one? Arguably, if you're only ever connecting ropes together to rappel, then I think you could definitely get away with only using one system, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think it is a good idea to understand some of the other systems just in case you encounter them for some reason. And also another reason that you might want to learn more than just the standard offset overhand bend, otherwise known as the EDK, which we're going to talk a lot more about in a minute, and why I don't like that name, might be that you are rappelling with a heavier load or with two people in a rescue scenario. But before we dive into these different types of knots, it's really worthwhile understanding the difference between an inline knot and an offset knot. So this is an offset knot. So this is an offset overhand bend. And why is it offset? What makes it an offset knot? Offset means that the knot is over to the side of the general line of pull of the rope. And this is actually really useful when you're rappelling, because this means that the knot can stay on the surface of the rock and generally kind of travels over the surface of the rock a lot more smoothly and is less likely to get snagged on small features on the rock. This is an example of an inline knot. This is a double Fisherman's, and as you can see here, the knot is in line with the general pull of the ropes. Now, one of the downsides with this type of knot is it does have the tendency to get snagged a little bit more easily on features, because this tail is actually, you know, sticking down into a feature, for example, over a lip, and it can get caught on small things. And that's really the case with all of the inline knots that exist for connecting two ropes together. It might not be too much of a problem, and there'll probably be plenty of people out there that use inline knots for their rappel connecting knot, but I would say that it's definitely more likely to get stuck or caught on things than an offset knot. One of the downsides with an offset knot is when it's really heavily loaded is they do have a tendency to start rolling along this tail, which is why we always want to keep the tail of an offset knot reasonably long, but not so long that it might be getting caught on things as you're going down. A rule of thumb with any offset knot that you might be using is to have a 30 centimeter tail. Now, how do we know what 30 centimeters is? So this is 30 centimeters right here. Can you memorize that? It's pretty much exactly from my wrist to my elbow. So this measurement here on most people, from their elbow to the start of their hand or just into their palm, is 30 centimeters. So that's a good thing to know when we're measuring the tails of our ropes for offset bends. As I mentioned earlier, having the tails too long can mean that the tails could be tying themselves in loops and getting caught on things as we pull those ropes down. So having the tails way longer than 30 centimeters is not really a very useful thing. Another important reason to keep the tails of these knots short is that when we have rigged them for rappel, we don't want to mistake these to be our rappel rope and us to load our device on there and our backup, for example, and then to come off our lanyard only to find that we're just about to rappel off the end of these tails. So let's dive into a few different ways that you can connect ropes together using different knots. And to start here, we're going to talk about offset knots. And we're going to start with the simplest, the easiest, and probably the one that everybody should know at the very least, the offset overhand bend. So here's how you tie the offset overhand bend. You take the two ends of the ropes like this, and you pull out a bunch of slack like so, roughly until about halfway up my bicep, for me, is where I start. And then what I do is I take my pistol like this, and I wrap the rope around the barrel of the pistol and over the back like this, and then I'm going to go back up through this pistol here and pull those tails out and pull those tails simultaneously so they end up being the same distance there. Now I check that the tails are 30 centimeters, so here it's actually just a little bit too long, so maybe I'm just going to chase a little bit back through like that and then pull that tension back through here. What I'm looking for in this knot is for it to be nice and neat. So I want all the strands here to be parallel when I tie this knot. I don't want any strands being crossed over or anything weird going on in the knot. It should all be parallel. And that's the same when you tie in with a figure of 8, for example, as well, right? So we're done. It's dressed. Well, no, there's another really important step when we're tying any knot, and that's to stress the knot. And the way that I like to do that is to give it a firm pull in each direction like that, and then pull each individual strand whilst holding the knot. Each individual strand I work my way through, so I do the two tails like that, and then I'm going to pull the two long ends, you know, the ends of the rope on the other side of it now. So now we've got a really nice, neatly tied, neatly dressed and stressed knot. Now this is ready to rappel on and we're ready to go. Obviously I'm showing you this knot here, but first you would thread one of these ropes through your rappel anchor, obviously. Okay, done. So we're all good, right? We don't need to know any more knots. This is the only one that you need to know. Okay, sure. Now it seems kind of small and kind of flimsy, and I think a lot of people have a bit of a problem with that. They sort of look at it and go, oh, I don't really trust that. It's, you know, it looks like it, yeah, oh, it's not really, You need to learn to trust this knot. The only thing that you could possibly do to get this to start rolling, which is what would happen, is if you were to really rappel super fast and then stop super hard on the rope and create a big bouncing effect on the rope. But I kind of do understand why some people don't, and there is something that you can do to back this knot up. And all we're going to do in that situation is tie a second overhand knot, like so, that's going to be right up next to the original knot. And actually what we can do here is we can eat into that tail of the rope that we had before. So we can actually have slightly shorter tails in this situation, because now the load is here and the only thing that could happen to this knot is it starts to roll, and it can't do that because now it's up against another knot. So we don't necessarily need as long a tails, which could actually be a good thing because they are slightly less likely to get caught on things as you're pulling them down. Again, we're going to make sure that we stress that knot and we pull each individual strand, which is just the two strands that are sticking out on the tail side of this knot. A key point here is to make sure that these knots are right up next to each other, because when we're pulling this down, there is a chance that it could get caught in a crack. And if these knots are slightly apart from each other, let's say like that, then this is definitely something that could get caught in a crack, and it's going to make it really difficult for you to pull that back down. You're going to have to pull the rope back up the way before you then pull it down. The really nice thing about a single offset overhand bend like this is actually there is a way that you can feed this through a munter hitch. Remember before when I was saying that you could lower somebody a full length of 2 ropes down a cliff? You would do that simply by lowering them on a munter hitch, which, yes, it would twist up your rope, but you're only doing this if maybe somebody's broken their arm, for example. And then you can actually feed the munter hitch through a large carabiner and work it through that carabiner and then continue lowering on the second rope. And that's something that you can only really do with the offset overhand bend. You can't really do that with any other knot. The backed up offset overhand bend is just a little bit too big to do that, and any of the inline knots that we're going to talk about later in this video, they simply won't work in that scenario. So this is definitely a really good one to learn, and as I say, this is going to do most people for most of what they're doing. Now this knot did get a pretty bad rep back in the day. People called it the European death knot, which it had a bad rep back in the day for rolling open and people would die. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's happened at some point. And what causes that to happen? A, it could be that the tails are too short. B, it could be that the knot isn't properly dressed. And C, it could be that the knot isn't properly stressed. So the 3 main important things here are make sure the tails are long enough, make sure it's properly dressed, and make sure it's properly stressed. But I've got a feeling that actually the offset overhand bend was actually misnamed the European death knot. This knot is probably the closest knot to the offset overhand bend, and this is the offset figure of 8 bend. Now, we don't use this to connect 2 ropes together anymore. The reason for that is this knot is much more prone to rolling, and because there's more material stored in this knot, it means that it rolls much further down the rope, which means that it's much more likely to come undone if the tails are too short. I've got a feeling actually that this is what gave the offset overhand bend its bad name of the European death knot, and I would propose that we actually call this the European death knot instead. The problem with this knot is it's a little bit bigger, and people tend to think, oh, it's a little bit bigger, therefore it's a little bit stronger, therefore it's a little bit safer. But for those reasons that I just mentioned, that it's way more likely to roll, it's definitely a knot that you want to avoid when you're tying your ropes together. So we've looked at the offset overhand bend, formerly known as the EDK. We've also looked at the backed up offset overhand bend, which is a knot that would be really good to use if you were simul rappelling, for example, with a casualty or a really heavy haul bag as well, for example. But let's look at two other knots that are offset knots that we could use, but we don't tend to use them so much because they're a little bit more complex to tie and they're a little bit harder to verify that you've tied them correctly. In this case, we're going to talk about the Gibbs knot, which is very similar to an overhand knot, except for the fact that you take another wrap around and through that hole before you pull it tight, like so. So that would look a little something like this. It's basically an overhand knot, but we've basically done an extra loop around these strands of rope with the tail, and this knot is a lot more stable in terms of when you're pulling it in an offset load like so, which means that it is less likely to roll open. The Gibbs knot would also be a good knot to know for connecting two ropes of vastly different diameter together. So for example, a single rope like this, which is the Volta Guide 9mm, and the Petzl Purline or the Petzl Radline. There's also a variation of this knot where rather than passing both ends through on that second wrap, we just pass one end through, and that would be known as the half Gibbs knot. Now, one of the problems with these knots is they're not particularly familiar with a lot of climbers, so it's quite difficult for people to know exactly what it is when you tie it. So if you know what it is, then it's easy to identify what it is. But if you don't know what it is, then how can you check that it's been tied correctly? By the way, if you're a reader rather than a watcher, I would really recommend this book by Andy Kirkpatrick, which is called Down. A lot of the information is in this book already, and some might even say that I'm just ripping Andy off because I'm just doing the video based exactly on his chapter of this subject on this and just uploading it onto YouTube. But anyway, Down, really worth checking out. Definitely have a full read of it if you're the type of person who likes to know lots of weird things that you'll probably never use, but also how to do things really, really well. I think this book is superb and there's lots of really good information in there. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of inline knots that you might want to use at certain points through your climbing career. The first knot that we're going to look at is the inline figure of 8 or the Flemish Bend. Now the way that we're going to form this is by tying a figure of 8 in the rope like that, like so, and then we're going to follow this back through much in the same way that you would when you're tying in, for example. So same rules apply for neatness. Start hard, finish easy. Going to come around like so. Come up through here, around like that, and finish easy in like that. Actually, we can chase these tails so they're a little bit shorter. Like so. So this is what it looks like, very familiar to you if you use a figure of 8 to tie in for your climbing anyway. But yeah, this is an inline knot because when we're pulling like this, the ropes are in line with each other. The knot isn't offset out of the direction of pull. So this is a very different knot than the offset figure of 8 bend, which is that really dangerous European death knot that we've been talking about that tends to roll open and kill people. This is very different, it's much stronger, but the same deal with any of these knots. Make sure that they're properly dressed and they're properly stressed by pulling each individual strand of that knot to make sure it's nice and tight, and that, yeah, checking all these lines are parallel, and you've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. A really good example of this might be attaching ropes together when you're fixing ropes, for example. It can also be tied like this, which is with an overhand knot instead. The nice thing about most of these inline knots is that when you tie those knots, then generally it breaks in the knot rather than pulling the knot apart when you put high levels of force through them. So the final knot we're going to have a look at here for connecting two ropes together is the double Fishermans, and this is formed by making 2 barrel knots, which is also coincidentally the knot that you use to close the end of a rope. So let's look at how you tie that without tying it around another rope. You make your pistol like this, and then you wrap over your fingers and then over twice, so you end up with 2 loops here with it crossing over the first strand there. Now we're going to chase this tail through those 2 loops, and that's how we end up with our barrel knot, and that's for closing the end of the system. Now essentially, if we were to loosen this knot up and then poke this tail through this hole of the rope here and then tie the knot again, that's going to be a double fisherman's. And what's essentially happening here is when I pull tight on this, those 2 knots are pulling against each other. So actually, if I pull it apart like that, you'll see that they're kind of away from each other, and I'm basically pulling those 2 barrel knots against each other. So same rules apply as ever. We're going to make sure it's properly dressed and properly stressed at each end, like so. And that's going to create a really strong way of connecting 2 ropes together as well in an inline knot. You will actually see quite a few people using this as the way that they connect their 2 ropes together for rappelling, and that's totally fine, but just remember that yes, with any inline knot, it is a little bit more likely to get stuck just because that tail can get hung up on things. There is also a way to tie it as a single, which is basically 2 overhand knots pulling against each other, but this isn't really regarded as being strong enough for this application, so it's not really something that you should be thinking about using. There is also a way to tie it as a triple fisherman's like this, which is generally considered a little bit overkill for connecting 2 dynamic ropes together, but it could be a really good way to connect a really slippery piece of Dyneema together, for example, because it's just going to grip a little bit harder than a double fisherman's and certainly a lot harder than a single fisherman's. So let's have a look at a couple of ways that you could tie 2 ropes together, but they don't really have any application within climbing. You could use a reef knot, which is really simple. You go left over right and under, right over left and under, and that's going to form our reef knot. And although that looks like a really beautiful, easy, simple knot to tie, and it's quite easy to remember how to do, it's not particularly strong, and also it does have the tendency to work itself loose after a while, which can cause some problems. You could actually create this knot in the middle and then have backup knots on either side of it, so that would be one way to use it, but that's basically like tying 3 knots. That's going to take quite a long time. Why would you do that? The other way that you could connect 2 ropes together is with a sheet bend, but similar to the reef knot, although it is a little bit stronger, it does have a tendency to work itself loose if you're pulling it, for example. So we definitely wouldn't be using a sheet bend to connect ropes together for rappelling, for example. So there you go, there's a whole bunch of different ways to connect your rope together and not connect your rope together. But before we sign off from this video, I just want to impress upon you the fact that the offset overhand bend, formerly known as the EDK, is probably the one knot that you need to learn how to tie well, neatly, and stress it properly. And then you also need to learn how to trust it, because you will see it and you will see lots of people using it out in the mountains. I have never seen one roll, but I have seen a figure of 8 bend starting to roll on somebody as they were rappelling, and it was pretty terrifying to watch, I'll be honest. The really nice thing about the offset overhand bend is it's just one knot that's super easy to tie. You can basically tie it without having to look at it, and it's super replicatable. It's super easy to tie with gloves on. It's easy to tie if your head torch runs out of battery, you can't see what's going on. You can even check it by feel without having to see anything that's going on with the knot. You can definitely tell that you've tied the correct knot. So focus on that one and then learn the other ones for a little bit of something to do. But basically, this is the knot that I think you should be using for rappelling. There you go. So thank you very much for watching that video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate that you do that. As I said, it's super easy to do, and it's free, and it's going to help me grow this channel more. But thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.